The bullet grazed so close to Victoria Owens's cheek that she felt the heat of it before she heard the crack of the rifle, and in that moment she understood that her father was truly dead, and she was alone in a world that wanted to swallow her whole. She threw herself behind the water trough outside the mercantile, her heart hammering against her ribs as wood splintered above her head. The year was 1878, and Spokane, Washington was supposed to be a town on the rise, a place where the railroad had brought civilization and opportunity. But civilization hadn't reached the men who wanted her father's land. An opportunity looked a lot like a shallow grave when you were a woman alone with nothing but a deed and a Winchester rifle. "Come out, Miss Owens!" The voice belonged to Dutch Carmichael, the foreman for the Cascade Cattle Company. "Make this easy on yourself. Sign over that property and we will let you walk away." Victoria pressed her back against the rough wood of the trough, her fingers tight around the rifle she had grabbed from her saddle before diving for cover. Her father had been dead 3 days. 3 days since his horse had come back without him. 3 days since they found him at the bottom of Fletcher's Canyon with his neck broken. The sheriff called it an accident. Victoria knew murder when she saw it, especially when the men who wanted her land started circling like vultures before her father was even cold in the ground. "I would rather eat dirt than sign anything for you," she shouted back, and she meant every word. The land was all she had left. 20 acres of good grazing land with water rights to Sterling Creek, the property her father had worked himself to the bone to buy after her mother died of cholera 5 years ago. It was not much, but it was hers, and she would be damned if she let these bastards take it. Another shot rang out, and water exploded from the trough above her head, spilling down in a cold rush that soaked her shoulders. She could hear men moving, boots on the packed dirt of Main Street, spreading out to flank her position. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. The mercantile was locked up for the night. The nearest building with an open door was the Dusty Rose Saloon, 30 feet of open ground away. She would never make it. Then she heard the sound of a horse moving fast, hooves pounding hard, and a voice cut through the evening air like a knife through silk. "That is enough." The shooting stopped. Victoria risked a glance around the edge of the trough and saw a rider between her and Carmichael's men, his horse dancing sideways, eyes rolling. The man sat easy in the saddle despite the tension crackling through the air, and even in the fading light she could see he was built like he had been carved from the same mountains that ringed the valley. Broad shoulders, strong hands on the reins, a face that looked like it had seen its share of hard weather and harder men. "This is none of your concern, Kincaid," Carmichael said, but there was something in his voice now, a note of caution that had not been there before. "When you start shooting women in the street, it becomes my concern," the man said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Put up your weapons and ride out. The Cascade Company has business with Miss Owens. Then you can conduct it through a lawyer in daylight like civilized people." The man called Kincaid shifted in his saddle, and his coat fell open just enough to show the gun at his hip. "Unless you would rather discuss it with me right now." The silence stretched out long enough for Victoria to count her own heartbeats, 10, 15, 20. Then Carmichael spat into the dirt. "This is not over." "It is for tonight," Kincaid said. Victoria watched as Carmichael and his 3 men mounted up and rode south down Main Street, their horses kicking up dust in the twilight. She stayed behind the trough until they were out of sight, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed, adrenaline turning to something that felt uncomfortably like tears. She blinked them back hard. Crying would not help. Crying would not save her land or bring her father back or make any of this right. The rider turned his horse toward her, and she got her first clear look at him. He was maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were sharp and assessing. There was a scar along his jawline, pale against sun-weathered skin, and his hands on the reins were marked with old calluses and newer rope burns. A working man then, a cowboy. "You can come out now," he said. "They are gone." Victoria stood slowly, keeping the Winchester pointed at the ground but not setting it down. She was 22 years old, and she had learned young not to trust men who showed up convenient. "I did not ask for your help." Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "No, I suppose you did not. But you needed it just the same." "I had the situation under control." "Is that what you call being pinned down with 4 guns on you?" He dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse toward her. "I am Vincent Kincaid. I own a small spread about 10 miles south of here." "I know who you are," Victoria said, though she did not. She had only been in Spokane for 6 months, and she had spent most of that time helping her father work their land. She had not had much time for socializing or learning who was who in the territory. His mouth quirked at the corner like he knew she was lying but was too polite to call her on it. "Then you have the advantage, though I'm guessing you're Victoria Owens." "What gave it away?" She gestured at the bullet holes in the water trough. "Lucky guess." He tied his horse to the hitching post and looked at her properly, and she felt something shift in the air between them. His eyes were gray, she realized, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they took her in with an attention that made her want to square her shoulders and lift her chin. "You are bleeding." She touched her cheek, where the bullet had passed, and her fingers came away red. "It is nothing. You should get that cleaned up. Infection is not nothing." "I said it is fine." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but she could not seem to help it. The fear was draining away and leaving anger in its place, hot and bright, and looking for somewhere to land. "I do not need a nursemaid any more than I needed rescuing." "Right," he said slowly. "You just need 4 men shooting at you to leave you alone." "They want my land." "I figured that much out." He picked up his reins again, and for a moment she thought he was going to mount up and ride away. Instead, he just stood there, watching her with those storm-gray eyes. And finally he said, "You have any place to stay tonight?" "I have a camp outside of town." "A camp?" He said it flat, like he was working hard to keep any judgment out of his voice. "By yourself?" "I can take care of myself." "Clearly." He looked at the bullet holes again, then back at her. "Look, I am not trying to tell you your business, but those men just rode south, and I would bet money that is the same direction as your camp. They might decide to pay you another visit once I'm not around." Victoria hated that he was right. She hated everything about this situation, the helplessness of it, the way the world kept trying to tell her she was too weak, too female, too stubborn to survive out here alone. But hating it would not change the facts. And the facts were that she could not afford to die tonight, not when her father's murderers were still walking around free. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, the words bitter on her tongue. "I have a room at the boarding house. You can take it for the night. I'll sleep in the livery stable with my horse." "I cannot pay you." "Did I ask you to?" She studied him, looking for the angle, the catch, the thing he wanted that he was not saying. Men did not help women for free, especially not women alone with property to their name, but his face gave nothing away, just that calm steadiness, and something else, something that looked almost like respect. "Why are you doing this, she asked finally. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had gone soft around the edges. "My mother was alone for a while, after my father died. She was stubborn too, would not ask for help, would not accept it when it was offered. I was 13 years old and trying to run a ranch and keep her alive at the same time." He shook his head. "She made it, but it was close. So when I see a woman who needs help, whether she wants to admit it or not, I try to remember what I wished someone had done for her." Victoria felt something crack open in her chest. Just a little. Just enough to let in a sliver of the grief she had been holding back since they buried her father. "I am sorry about your mother." "She is fine now. Remarried a banker in Portland, lives in a house with indoor plumbing, and complains about how boring it is." His smile was crooked, fond. "But thank you." She looked down at her rifle, at her hands still gripping it white-knuckled, and made a decision. "All right, One night, but I am keeping my gun." "Would not dream of asking you to give it up," Vincent said, and this time his smile reached his eyes. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, a tiny Chinese woman who took one look at Victoria's bleeding cheek and started scolding in rapid Cantonese while pulling her inside. Vincent translated the important parts, mostly that Victoria needed to sit down immediately and let herself be taken care of before she caught infection and died. And did she want to break Mrs. Chen's heart by dying? Victoria sat. Mrs. Chen cleaned the wound with sharp-smelling alcohol that made Victoria's eyes water, then smeared it with something that smelled like herbs and felt cool against her skin. The whole time she kept up a running commentary that Vincent translated with increasing amusement. "She says you are very brave, but also very stupid. And bravery without sense just gets you killed faster," he said at one point. "Tell her I appreciate the medical attention and the life advice," Victoria said dryly. Mrs. Chen apparently understood more English than she let on because she laughed and patted Victoria's shoulder before disappearing into the back of the house. She returned with a plate of dumplings and a pot of tea, which she set on the small table in the front room, and gestured for them both to eat. "I should go," Vincent said, but Mrs. Chen shook her head firmly and pointed at the chair across from Victoria. "She says you need to eat too, and she will not let you sleep in the stable when there is a perfectly good sofa in the parlor," Victoria translated, this time surprising herself. Maybe she understood more Cantonese than she thought, or maybe she just recognized the universal language of a woman who would not take no for an answer. They ate in silence for a while. The dumplings hot and savory and better than anything Victoria had tasted in weeks. She had been living on hardtack and jerky at her camp, saving her money for the lawyer she would need to fight the Cascade Cattle Company's claim. It had not occurred to her until now how hungry she actually was, how tired, how close to the edge she had been running. "Tell me about your father," Vincent said quietly, setting down his teacup. Victoria's first instinct was to say no, to keep that grief locked up tight where it could not be used against her. But there was something about the way he asked, gentle and genuinely curious, that made her want to answer. "He was a good man," she said finally. "Fair, hard-working. He grew up in Pennsylvania, worked in the coal mines until they killed his brother, and he decided there had to be a better way to break your back for a living." She smiled despite herself. He always said the West was for people who were too stubborn to accept what the world told them they had to be. That out here, you could build something that was yours. Sounds like you take after him. He used to say I could out-stubborn a mule in a staring contest. Her throat tightened. It drove him crazy sometimes. How I would not listen, would not back down. We fought about it the morning before he rode out to check the north fence. The last thing I said to him was that he worried too much. Vincent reached across the table and covered her hand with his just for a moment, just long enough for the warmth of it to sink in. "He knew you loved him." "How do you know?" "Because stubborn people always do. We just show it differently." They talked late into the night, long after Mrs. Chen had taken the empty dishes away and banked the fire in the stove. Vincent told her about his ranch, the 70 head of cattle he was trying to build into something sustainable, the way the winter had been hard but not as hard as the one before. Victoria told him about her father's dream of breeding horses, how they had just bought their first mare before he died, a pretty buckskin with good lines and a gentle disposition. "What will you do?" Vincent asked as the clock on the mantel chimed midnight. "About the land, I mean." "Keep it," Victoria said simply. "Fight them. I do not care what it takes. Even if it kills you? Especially then." She met his eyes across the dim room. "My father died for that land. I will not let his death be for nothing." Vincent was quiet for a long time, his face shadowed in the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been admiration. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most stubborn. Can I be both? I think you already are." He stood, rolling his shoulders like they ached. "You should get some sleep. I will be downstairs if you need anything." Victoria watched him go. This stranger who had stepped between her and bullets without knowing her name, who had given up his bed and bought her dinner, and listened to her talk about her dead father like it mattered. She did not trust him, not really, not yet. But she thought maybe she could, given time. That thought should have scared her more than it did. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of frying bacon. For one confused moment, she thought she was back in her father's cabin, that the last few days had been a nightmare, and he would be downstairs cooking breakfast like always. Then reality crashed back in, and she had to press her face into the pillow to keep from making a sound that might bring people running. When she finally made it downstairs, washed and dressed in the same dusty clothes from yesterday, Vincent was sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Chen, drinking coffee and looking like he had not slept at all. His eyes went to her face immediately, tracking to the bandage on her cheek. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I got shot at," Victoria said. Then, because Mrs. Chen was watching with knowing eyes, "But better. Thank you, Mrs." Chen said something in Cantonese and Vincent smiled. "She says you have good color this morning and probably will not die after all." "That is reassuring," Victoria said dryly, accepting the plate of eggs and bacon that Mrs. Chen pressed into her hands. They ate quickly, both aware that daylight was burning and there was work to be done. Vincent paid Mrs. Chen for the room and the meals over Victoria's protests, then walked with her to the livery stable where her horse was boarded. The gray mare whickered when she saw Victoria, nosing at her pockets for the sugar cubes she usually carried. "Sorry, girl," Victoria murmured, stroking the soft nose. "I did not have time to go shopping yesterday. Here." Vincent held out his palm, 2 sugar cubes sitting in the center. "My horse does not care for them anyway." Victoria fed them to the mare, hyper-aware of Vincent standing close behind her, near enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air. She should move away, put some proper distance between them, but she found she did not want to. It had been a long time since anyone had stood at her back and felt like safety instead of threat. "I need to go see the sheriff," she said, turning to face him. "File a formal complaint about last night." Vincent's expression went carefully neutral. "Sheriff Dawson is a good man, but he is in the Cascade Company's pocket. Has been for years." "Then what am I supposed to do? Just let them run me off my own land?" "No." He said it firmly, no hesitation. "But you need to be smart about this. Going to Dawson will just tip them off that you are not backing down, and they will come at you harder next time." "So what? I just hide? Give up?" "I did not say that." He scrubbed a hand over his jaw, thinking. "You need leverage. Something that makes you more valuable alive and in possession of that land than dead or run off. And where exactly am I supposed to find that?" "Let me ask around. I know some people, other ranchers who have been dealing with Cascade's strong arm tactics. Maybe we can build a coalition, present a united front." He paused. "In the meantime, you should not go back to your camp alone. It is not safe." Victoria felt her spine go rigid. "I am not going to hide in town while they tear up my property." "I am not asking you to hide. I am asking you to be practical." His voice was patient but firm, like he was talking to a spooked horse. "You can stay at my place. I have a spare room in the barn that my foreman used before he moved into town with his new wife. It is clean and dry and far enough from my main house that people will not talk." "I do not care if people talk." "Maybe you should." He stepped closer, and his voice dropped low enough that she had to strain to hear. "You are a woman alone in territory where that makes you a target. Your reputation is one of the few protections you have left. Let me help you keep it intact." Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she did not need his protection or his spare room or anything else from him. But the truth was she did need help, and pride was a luxury she could not afford right now. Her father had always said there was a difference between being stubborn and being stupid, and only a fool could not tell which was which. "1 week," she said finally. "I will stay for 1 week while you ask around, but after that I'm going back to my land whether it is safe or not." 1 week, Vincent agreed, and held out his hand. She took it, his palm warm and calloused against hers, and felt the world tilt just slightly on its axis. Vincent's ranch was exactly what she expected. Practical, well-maintained, and built for function over beauty. The main house was a simple two-story structure with a wide porch and shutters that had seen better days. The barn was newer, sturdy pine planking with a good roof and stalls for at least a dozen horses. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, red and white Herefords that looked healthy and content. "It is not much," Vincent said as they rode up the long drive, "but it is mine, free and clear." "It is beautiful," Victoria said, and meant it. There was something honest about the place, something that spoke of hard work and careful planning. It reminded her of what her father had been trying to build before Cascade killed him. The spare room turned out to be more than just a room in the barn. It was a small apartment, really, with a wood stove and a real bed and windows that let in the afternoon sun. Someone had left wildflowers in a jar on the table, and the sheets on the bed smelled like soap and fresh air. "My foreman's wife made it nice for him," Vincent said from the doorway. "She was always bringing things out, trying to make it more like a home. I have not changed anything since they left." "It is perfect," Victoria said, setting her saddlebags on the chair. "Thank you." "I will leave you to settle in. Supper is at 6 if you want to join me, but no pressure." He hesitated like he wanted to say something else, then just nodded and left. Victoria spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property, careful to stay within sight of the buildings. She found the creek that ran along the western edge of Vincent's land, cold and clear and full of smooth river stones. She watched his cattle graze and noted the way he had rotated his pastures to keep the grass from being overgrazed. She saw the vegetable garden behind the house, neat rows of potato plants and beans and squash that someone had been tending with care. Everything about the place spoke of a man who was building something to last, who thought beyond next week or next month to next year and the year after that. It made something ache in her chest, seeing what her father had wanted and would never have. She showed up at the main house at 6 exactly, washed, and with her hair braided back in a way that felt almost civilized. Vincent answered the door in a clean shirt with his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with small scars. "You came," he said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "You offered food. I'm not fool enough to turn that down." He laughed and held the door open. "Come in, then. I hope you like stew, because that is about the extent of my cooking skills." The inside of the house was as practical as the outside. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast iron stove, a table big enough for 6 people, though only 2 chairs were pulled up to it. The walls were bare except for a single photograph in a simple frame, a woman with kind eyes standing next to a lean man with Vincent's same jaw. "Your parents?" Victoria asked. "Yeah, taken about a year before my father died." Vincent stirred the pot on the stove, releasing the rich smell of beef and vegetables. He went out in the winter to check on a cow that was calving and got caught in a blizzard. They found him 3 days later, frozen about half a mile from the house. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." But his voice said it still hurt, that some wounds never really healed. "My mother held on for 5 more years before she admitted she could not do it alone. That was when she sold the place and moved to Portland." They ate in comfortable silence, the stew hot and filling and better than Victoria had expected. Vincent kept the conversation light, asking about her mare, the best routes for checking fence lines, anything but the topic of Cascade and what they might do next. Victoria appreciated it more than she could say. After dinner, she helped him wash dishes, standing side by side at the basin while he scrubbed and she dried. It felt domestic, intimate in a way that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow did not. When their hands brushed reaching for the same pot, she felt that same spark of awareness from the night before, like lightning dancing along her skin. "I will ride into town tomorrow," Vincent said, hanging up the dish towel. "Talk to some of the other ranchers, see what I can learn about Cascade's plans. You should stay here, keep your head down." "I want to come with you." "Victoria." He turned to face her and his eyes were serious. "I know you do not like being told what to do, and I respect that. But right now the best thing you can do is let me handle this. You going into town will just antagonize them." My stubbornness is the only thing I have left, she said quietly. If I give that up, if I start hiding and letting other people fight my battles, then what am I? What is left? Vincent looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. You really do not know when to quit, do you? My father said it was my worst quality. Your father was wrong. He said it with such conviction that it made her throat tight. Your stubbornness, your strength, the way you keep standing up no matter how many times they knock you down, that is what is going to keep you alive. Do not ever let anyone tell you it is something to be ashamed of. She could not speak, could not find words for what his faith in her meant, so she just nodded, and when he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, she let him. The next morning, Vincent left before dawn, and Victoria spent the day working around the ranch to keep herself from going crazy with worry. She mucked stalls, mended a section of fence that was starting to sag, hauled water for the garden. Physical labor had always helped her think, and right now she needed to think more than anything. The problem was not just Cascade wanting her land. The problem was that they had the law on their side, at least locally, and she had nothing but a piece of paper that said she was the rightful owner. In a fair fight, that would be enough. But this was not a fair fight, and unless she found a way to level the playing field, she was going to lose everything. By the time Vincent rode back in the late afternoon, she had worked herself into a state somewhere between determined and desperate. She met him at the barn, helping him unsaddle his horse while he filled her in on what he had learned. It is worse than I thought, he said grimly. Cascade has been systematically buying up or running off every small rancher in the valley. Your land is the last piece they need to control the entire water system. Sterling Creek? Exactly. If they own your land, they own the creek, and everyone downstream has to pay them for water rights. He shook his head. It is a good business strategy if you do not care about destroying people's lives. There has to be something we can do. Some legal recourse. I talked to a lawyer in town, man named Patterson, who was not in Cascade's pocket. He said if you can prove your father was murdered and Cascade was behind it, that might be enough to invalidate any claim they try to make on the property, but proving it is the hard part. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. How would we prove it? We would need evidence, a witness, documents, something that ties them directly to your father's death. Vincent met her eyes. And even then, we would have to convince a judge to hear the case, which means going over Sheriff Dawson's head to the territorial court. So basically impossible. I did not say impossible, just difficult. He paused. Patterson also said there is another option. If you were to marry, your husband would have equal claim to the land, which would make it harder for Cascade to intimidate you into selling. Victoria felt her face heat. I am not getting married just to save my property. I am not saying you should. I'm just telling you what he said. But there was something in Vincent's voice, something careful and measured that made her look at him more closely. Did he suggest anyone in particular? She asked slowly. Vincent was very focused on hanging up his saddle. He might have mentioned that a marriage between neighboring ranchers would create a larger, more defensible property. Neighboring ranchers, like you and me. Like I said, I am just telling you what he suggested. But his ears were red, and he would not quite meet her eyes. Victoria did not know whether to laugh or cry. The idea was absurd, marrying a man she had known for barely 2 days just to keep her land. But it was also practical, which was maybe why it made a strange kind of sense in her head. And if she was being honest with herself, there were worse men to be married to than Vincent Kincaid. That is the most unromantic proposal I have ever heard, she said finally. It was not a proposal. Now he did look at her, and his eyes were fierce. If I were going to propose to you, Victoria, it would not be because a lawyer suggested it was good strategy. It would be because I wanted to, because I could not imagine doing anything else. Her breath caught. Vincent. But I'm not proposing, he continued, like he had not just said something that made her heart skip. Because you deserve better than a business arrangement. You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, who respects your strength and your stubbornness, and does not try to change you into something easier to manage. And when you find that person, I hope he is smart enough to hold on tight." He left before she could respond, striding out of the barn into the gathering dusk. And Victoria was left standing in the shadows, wondering when exactly she had started falling for him. The answer came that night when she could not sleep, tossing and turning in the small bed while her mind raced through possibilities. Marriage to Vincent would solve her immediate problem, but it would create a dozen others. What if he wanted things from her she could not give? What if he expected her to give up her independence, her land, her identity? What if she was just trading one cage for another? But every time those fears rose up, she thought about the way he had stepped between her and bullets without hesitation. The way he listened when she talked about her father like the words mattered. The way he had defended her stubbornness like it was something to be admired instead of something to be broken. She was still awake when the sun rose, and she made her decision in the gray light of dawn. Vincent was in the barn feeding the horses when she found him. He looked up at her approach, and something in her face must have given her away because he set down the bucket slowly. "I have been thinking about what you said," Victoria started. "About marriage." "Victoria, I told you I was not proposing." "I know, but what if I am?" She took a breath, squared her shoulders. "Marry me, Vincent, not because it is good strategy, but because I think you might be the only man alive who would not try to take what is mine and make it his. Because when you look at me, you see a person worth defending, not a problem to be solved. Because I trust you, and trust is something I do not give lightly." Vincent stared at her like she had just sprouted a second head. "You are serious?" "Completely. We can keep separate houses if you want, separate lives, just on paper, just enough to make it harder for Cascade to push me around." Even as she said it, she knew she was lying to herself. She did not want separate houses or separate lives. She wanted what she had seen in her parents' marriage before her mother died: partnership, respect, love that grew from shared struggles and small kindnesses. "No," Vincent said, and her heart dropped. Then he was crossing the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face, careful of the bandage still on her cheek. "If we do this, we do it right. Not separate houses, not on paper. A real marriage, with everything that means." "Everything?" Her voice came out breathless. "Everything," he confirmed. And then he was kissing her, slow and deep and thorough, like he had all the time in the world to learn the shape of her mouth. Victoria's hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping hard, and she kissed him back with all the fear and hope and desperate want that had been building in her chest since the moment he rode between her and danger. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to court you properly," he said. "Even if we only have a week before we need to file the marriage certificate, you deserve that much." "I do not need courting." "I know, but I want to do it anyway." He smiled, that crooked smile that made her heart skip. "Let me do this right, Victoria. Let me show you what it looks like when a man admires your strength instead of trying to break it." So she let him court her, in the compressed, intense way of people who know time is short. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow beyond the creek and taught her to rope cattle in the practice pen behind the barn. She cooked dinner for him in his kitchen, and they talked late into the night about everything and nothing. Her mother's laugh, his father's stubbornness, the way the mountains looked when the sun set behind them. They rode out to her property together, both armed, and spent an afternoon documenting the damage Cascade's men had done in her absence. Someone had cut her fences and driven off her cattle. The cabin her father built had been ransacked, her mother's china shattered, her father's books torn to pieces. Victoria stood in the wreckage and felt rage burn away the grief that had been drowning her. "They will pay for this," she said quietly. "Yes," Vincent agreed. "They will." They gathered what they could salvage and rode back to Vincent's ranch in the gathering dusk. That night, sitting on the porch of the main house with coffee going cold in their cups, Vincent told her about the plan he had been forming. "Patterson found something," he said. "A witness. one of Cascade's former employees who was there when they planned your father's murder. He is willing to testify, but he needs protection. If we can keep him alive long enough to get him in front of a judge, we can bring down the whole operation." "When?" Victoria asked. "The territorial judge arrives in 3 days. Patterson is filing for an emergency hearing." Vincent looked at her seriously. "But we need to be married before then. Legally, it will give you standing to pursue the case even if Cascade tries to claim you are just a hysterical woman making accusations." "How progressive of the law," Victoria said dryly. "I did not make the rules." He reached over and took her hand. "But I will use them to protect you any way I can." They were married the next day in a simple ceremony at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, with the widow herself as witness and Patterson as the other. Victoria wore a borrowed dress that was too short in the hem and too tight in the shoulders, and Vincent wore his best shirt with his hair slicked back and shaving cuts on his jaw. It was nothing like the wedding she had imagined as a girl, but when Vincent slid his mother's ring onto her finger and promised to honor her stubbornness as much as her strength, she could not imagine anything more perfect. That night she moved her things from the barn apartment to the main house, to the bedroom across the hall from Vincent's. He had been clear that he would not push her, that they would take things at whatever pace she was comfortable with, and she loved him for it even as she ached with wanting him. But when she lay alone in the unfamiliar bed, listening to him move around in his own room, she realized that waiting was just another form of fear, and she was done being afraid. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, still mostly dressed, staring at nothing. He looked up when she knocked, and something hot and bright flared in his eyes when he saw her standing in the doorway in her nightgown. "Victoria," he said, his voice rough, "you should not be here." "I am your wife," she said simply. "Where else would I be? I do not want you to feel obligated. I do not feel obligated. I feel like I want to be here with you right now." She crossed to him, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. "I am stubborn, remember? If I did not want this, you would know." He laughed, shaky and disbelieving, and then he was pulling her down to him, kissing her like she was air, and he was drowning. She went willingly, eagerly, her hands finding the buttons of his shirt while his found the ties of her nightgown. They came together with the desperate urgency of people who know the world might end tomorrow, and when he moved over her, in her, she felt something inside her chest crack open and flood with light. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the moonlight, Vincent traced idle patterns on her shoulder and whispered, "I love you. I know it is too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I love you anyway. Your stubbornness and your strength and the way you keep fighting even when everything is stacked against you." Victoria turned to face him, cupping his jaw in her palm. "I love you too. I think I have since the moment you rode between me and bullets without knowing if I was worth dying for." "You are worth everything," he said fiercely, "and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." The hearing was set for 3 days later, and those 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and fear. The witness, a grizzled old cowhand named Sykes, was being kept safe at a ranch 2 valleys over. Patterson worked around the clock building their case, and Victoria and Vincent fortified the ranch knowing that Cascade would not go down without a fight. They came the night before the hearing, a dozen men with torches and guns intending to burn Vincent out and kill anyone who got in their way. But Vincent had called in favors from every rancher who had a grudge against Cascade, and they met fire with firepower. The battle was short and brutal, fought in the yard between the barn and the house, and when it was over, 3 of Cascade's men were dead and the rest were fleeing into the night. Victoria stood on the porch with her rifle still smoking. Vincent at her side, bleeding from a graze across his ribs, but alive, so blessedly alive. The barn had caught fire, but they had put it out before it spread. The house was riddled with bullet holes, but still standing. They had won, but it had been close. "That was stupid," Victoria said, her hands shaking as she set down the rifle. "That was so stupid. They could have killed you." "They could have killed you too," Vincent pointed out, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. But we are both still here. Barely. She turned to him. And now that the danger was past, the fear came flooding in. Do not ever do that again. Do not ever make me think I am going to lose you. Then I guess we will just have to not lose, he said, and kissed her hard enough to bruise. The hearing the next day was anticlimactic after the violence of the night before. Sykes testified that he had been present when Dutch Carmichael and the Cascade Company's owner, a man named Thaddeus Crane, who rarely showed his face in Spokane, had planned to sabotage the fence line on Victoria's property and spook her father's horse into running. They had wanted it to look like an accident, and it had worked until Victoria started asking questions. The judge, a stern woman named Harriet Collins, who had no patience for cowards or cheats, heard the evidence and ruled in Victoria's favor. Cascade's claim on the property was dismissed and warrants were issued for the arrest of Carmichael and Crane. More than that, Judge Collins ordered a full investigation into Cascade's business practices throughout the territory, which would likely see the company broken up and sold off for parts. Victoria walked out of that courthouse with Vincent's hand in hers and felt something in her chest finally unclench. It was over. Her father's death would not go unanswered. Her land was safe, and she had a partner who saw her strength instead of trying to diminish it. They went home to the ranch, to the bullet-scarred house, and the fire-damaged barn, and the cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture like the world had not almost ended. And they started building the life Victoria's father had dreamed of, breeding horses, running cattle, making something that would last. Vincent taught her everything he knew about ranching, and she taught him that stubbornness and compromise were not opposite things, that you could hold your ground on what mattered while still bending on what did not. They fought sometimes, loud and passionate, but they always came back together because they both knew what they had was rare and worth protecting. A year after they married, Victoria gave birth to a son with Vincent's gray eyes and her stubborn chin. They named him James, after her father, and Victoria cried when she held him for the first time, thinking about all the things her father would miss, all the joy he would never see. But Vincent was there, solid and steady, holding her and their son while she grieved, and somehow that made it bearable. 2 years after that came a daughter with dark hair and her grandmother's kind eyes, named Sarah after Vincent's mother. And 3 years after that came another son, quieter than his brother but just as determined, who they named Thomas because it meant twin. And he looked so much like James that people could hardly tell them apart. They built their ranch into something that mattered, not just to them but to the community. They hired fairly, paid well, and never forgot what it felt like to be pushed around by people with more power. When Spokane incorporated as a city in 1881, Vincent served on the first city council, fighting for regulations that would prevent another company from doing what Cascade had tried to do. And Victoria ran the horse breeding operation they had dreamed of, becoming known throughout the territory for her eye for quality bloodlines and her ability to gentle even the wildest colt. People said she could out-stubborn any horse in Washington Territory, and she took it as the compliment it was meant to be. On their 10th anniversary, sitting on the porch they had rebuilt after the firefight, watching their children play in the yard, and the sun set behind the mountains, Vincent turned to her and said, "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me instead of someone you actually had time to know?" Victoria looked at him, at the gray in his hair that had not been there 10 years ago, at the lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun and laughing at their children's antics. She thought about everything they had built together, all the ways he had supported her and challenged her and loved her exactly as she was. "Not for a single second," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "My stubbornness might be what I had left when we met, but you are what I chose to build everything else on, and I would make that same choice every single day for the rest of my life." Vincent kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise, and she tasted the future in it. More children maybe, more challenges definitely, more years of stubbornness and strength and love that grew deeper with every season. The sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Victoria Owens Kincaid knew with absolute certainty that she had won more than just her father's land. She had won a life worth fighting for, a partner worth standing beside, and a future that stretched out bright and unbroken before her. Her stubbornness had saved her when she had nothing left. But Vincent's love, his unwavering belief in her strength, had given her everything she needed to not just survive, but to thrive. And that, she thought as she leaned into his shoulder and watched their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, was the real victory. The ranch prospered over the years, becoming one of the most respected operations in Washington Territory. Victoria's horses were sought after as far south as California and as far east as Montana, known for their intelligence and temperament as much as their beauty. Vincent's cattle operation grew steadily, and together they purchased more land, always careful to leave water access for their neighbors, remembering what Cascade had tried to do. Their children grew strong and confident, raised by parents who believed that stubbornness and kindness were not mutually exclusive traits. James became a lawyer, inspired by Patterson's work to bring down Cascade, and dedicated his practice to defending small ranchers against larger corporate interests. Sarah married a teacher and moved to Seattle, where she opened a school that accepted students regardless of their ability to pay. Thomas stayed on the ranch, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Vincent and Victoria grew older, showing the same careful stewardship his parents had modeled. In 1895, on a crisp autumn morning when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the air smelled like wood smoke and possibility, Victoria and Vincent rode out to the place where her father had died. They had come here every year since his death, a pilgrimage of memory and honor, and each year the pain was a little less sharp, though never fully gone. "He would be proud of you," Vincent said, as he always did. "He would be proud of us," Victoria corrected, as she always did. "None of this would have been possible without you." They stood there in silence, holding hands. Two people who had started as strangers and become something inseparable. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and pine, and Victoria felt a sense of peace settle over her that she had not known was possible in those dark days after her father died. "Ready to head back?" Vincent asked eventually. "Not yet." Victoria turned to him. This man who had stood by her through everything, who had defended her right to be stubborn and strong and uncompromising in a world that wanted women to be none of those things. "I want to stay here a little longer. Remember what we are fighting for." "We are not fighting anymore, love. We won." "Maybe this battle," Victoria agreed, "but there will always be another one. Someone will always want what we have built, and we need to stay vigilant." Vincent smiled, that same crooked smile that had stolen her heart 2 decades ago. Still stubborn as ever. "You would not love me if I was not." "True," he admitted, pulling her close, "but I also love you for about 1,000 other reasons. Your stubbornness is just the foundation." They stayed there until the sun started to sink toward the horizon, then rode home together through the gathering dusk, side by side the way they had been for 20 years and would be for whatever years remained. And when they crested the last hill and saw their ranch spread out before them, lights glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimneys, and the promise of family and warmth and home waiting, Victoria felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly took her breath away. She had lost so much when her father died, but she had found something too, something precious and rare, a partnership built on mutual respect, a love that had been tested and proven true, and a legacy that would outlive them both. Her stubbornness had been the only thing she had left when Vincent Kincaid rode into her life, but his admiration for that strength, his unwavering belief that she could be both stubborn and worthy of love, had transformed that single quality into the foundation for everything else. Years later, when Victoria was 80 years old and her hair had gone silver and her hands had grown stiff with arthritis, she would tell her grandchildren the story of how she met their grandfather. She would tell them about the bullets that nearly killed her, about the land she refused to give up, about the cowboy who stepped between her and danger and never asked her to be anything but herself. And when they asked her what the secret was, how she and Vincent had stayed in love for more than 50 years, she would smile and say, "He admired my stubborn strength instead of trying to break it. And I loved him for seeing me clearly and choosing me anyway. Everything else was just details." Vincent would laugh from his chair by the fire and add, "The details were pretty important too, like the fact that your grandmother could out-stubborn a barn full of mules and I was smart enough not to try to change her." And their grandchildren would laugh and roll their eyes, but they would remember those words. They would remember that strength and stubbornness were not things to be ashamed of, that the right person would admire those qualities instead of trying to diminish them, that real love meant standing beside each other through the battles and celebrating the victories together. Victoria Owens Kincaid died in her sleep at the age of 86, with Vincent holding her hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around. Her last words were, "Do not let anyone tell you that being stubborn is a weakness. It is what kept me alive long enough to find all of you." And then she closed her eyes and drifted away, peaceful and content, knowing that the legacy she and Vincent had built would endure long after they were gone. Vincent followed her 6 months later, his heart simply giving out one morning while he was saddling his horse to ride out to the north pasture. The doctor said it was age, the natural end of a long and well-lived life, but everyone who knew him understood the truth. He had lost the other half of his soul, and there was no coming back from that. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together under a stone that read, "Victoria and Vincent Kincaid, partners in all things. Their stubborn strength changed the world." And on summer evenings when the light turned gold and the wind whispered through the grass, people would sometimes see a man and a woman walking hand in hand across that hill, 2 ghosts or 2 memories or just a trick of the fading light. But anyone who saw them would feel a sense of hope, a reminder that real love existed, that strength was something to be celebrated, and that stubbornness in the service of what mattered most was never a quality to be ashamed of. The ranch continued for generations, always in the hands of their descendants, always run with the same principles of fairness and stewardship that Victoria and Vincent had established. And whenever a child was born to that family, whether boy or girl, they would be told the story of their great-great-grandmother who refused to back down and the cowboy who loved her for it. Because some stories are worth remembering, some loves are worth celebrating, and some stubborn, strong-willed women change the world simply by refusing to give up what is theirs and finding a partner brave enough to stand beside them. That was Victoria and Vincent's legacy, not just the land or the horses or the wealth they had built, but the example they had set. That being stubborn did not mean being alone, that strength could be soft and love could be fierce, and that the right partnership could transform 2 separate lives into something greater than the sum of its parts. Their story became legend in Spokane, passed down through generations, embellished and refined until it was hard to tell where truth ended and myth began. But the core of it remained always the same: a woman who refused to give up, a man who admired her for it, and a love that proved stubbornness and strength were not obstacles to happiness, but the very foundation of it. And so the story ends where it began, with Victoria standing alone against the world, stubbornness the only thing she had left. But this time the ending is different, because this time she found someone who saw that stubbornness and called it strength, who stood beside her instead of trying to stand in front of her, who loved her not despite her rough edges but because of them. That was the real miracle, the true heart of the story. Not that she survived, though she did, not that she won, though she did that too, but that she found someone who understood that her stubborn strength was not something to be overcome but something to be celebrated, someone who built his life around honoring that quality instead of trying to soften it. And in the end, that made all the difference.